Reports are emerging that a rift is widening amid growing tension between Prince Harry and King Charles.
The decision was not another warning. It was not a temporary punishment. King Charles had reached the point he had spent months avoiding, and when the final order was placed before him, he signed it. Camilla would retain her position as his wife, but her independent royal authority, ceremonial privileges, and access to several internal crown functions were being formally restricted. Then Prince Harry learned what had happened, and his reaction shattered the silence inside the family. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles sat alone with the directive and read its final paragraph twice. The private royal directive was an internal instruction from the sovereign defining who could exercise certain duties, receive selected briefings, and approve actions carried out in the crown's name. This one was brutally specific. Camilla would lose several independent ceremonial privileges. Selected crown briefings would no longer reach her automatically, and important official actions connected to her position would require the king's authorization. He held the pen above the page for several seconds. Then he signed. No relief followed. He simply pushed the paper away. Camilla received the decision privately, and disbelief came before anger. She asked the senior aide delivering the message whether the restrictions had truly come from her husband rather than from advisors attempting to protect him. The answer was immediate. They had. The queen consort went silent. Her marriage was not being dissolved, and her public title had not disappeared. But that almost made the blow more painful. She would remain beside Charles while knowing that parts of the authority she had once exercised without question had been deliberately pulled back by him. Harry reacted very differently. When the prince was informed through a documented private exchange with a family intermediary, his anger was immediate and fierce. He did not see only a dispute between husband and wife. He saw a father once again using royal structure to redraw the place of someone inside the family, after trust had broken down. That interpretation touched something raw in him. Charles had intended the order to settle one crisis, but his son was already connecting it to another. The deeper problem had been building long before the signature. Charles had spent weeks receiving a sealed internal file containing records of disputed decisions, questions over access, and concerns surrounding the limits of Camilla's influence. She knew fragments of those concerns, but not the full weight of what had been gathered. Harry knew even less. Yet once he understood that the king had been preparing this move quietly, his fury hardened into something more personal. And as Harry began to understand what Charles had really done, the story moved away from titles and protocol, and directly into the wounds connecting a husband, a wife, a father, and a son. Royal disputes become dangerous when they stop being about power and begin touching old wounds. For Charles, this was a decision against the woman who had stood beside him through decades of controversy. For Camilla, it felt like judgment from the one person whose loyalty she believed was secure. William saw a monarch protecting the crown. Harry saw something darker, and suddenly the argument was no longer only about the queen. Camilla sat opposite Charles with the signed directive already between them, but she barely looked at it. The practical meaning was clear enough. Royal authority meant the duties, access, and influence granted to a senior member of the family when acting in the crown's name, and Charles had deliberately narrowed hers. The deeper wound was harder to define. He wanted to preserve their marriage while separating personal loyalty from institutional trust. She understood the distinction. She also hated it. Camilla finally asked the question neither of them had wanted to hear. Did he still trust her as his wife, even if he no longer trusted her judgment inside royal affairs? Charles did not answer quickly, and that hesitation cut deeper than anger would have. He told her their marriage was not under review, but the queen consort heard something colder beneath the reassurance. She feared that he had already accepted a version of recent events in which she was not misunderstood, not careless, but responsible. Harry reacted as though that fear confirmed something he already believed. He called his father directly, and his anger came fast. The prince had spent years distancing himself from palace machinery, yet exclusion still struck a nerve, because he knew what it felt like when family conflict became tied to status, access, and institutional consequence. Charles refused to debate the directive over the phone. Harry heard restraint as indifference, and accused him of using the crown to punish people once trust collapsed. William watched the conflict tighten around his father and understood the danger immediately. In a documented private conversation with Charles, the future king quietly supported clearer boundaries around Camilla's authority, but he warned that Harry would not treat this as one isolated decision. The prince believed his brother could turn it into a broader argument about how the monarchy handles anyone who falls out of favor. Charles listened, knowing the crisis was already spreading beyond the original dispute. The call with Harry ended badly. Charles lowered the phone and remained motionless beside his desk, while his son continued pacing elsewhere, furious that the conversation had closed before either man had said what he truly meant. Camilla, meanwhile, was no longer afraid of losing ceremonial access. She was afraid her husband believed the case against her. That fury had a beginning, and it could be traced to one private Windsor gathering where Camilla made a choice Charles could never forget. Weeks before the final order, nothing about Camilla's position appeared publicly unstable. She carried out engagements, remained beside Charles, and moved through royal life with familiar confidence. But behind closed doors, one incident had already changed everything. During a private Windsor strategy meeting, she made a demand concerning William's future authority that Charles had never authorized. The room went quiet. William remembered every word, and for the king, that evening became the point of no return. Charles had already been struggling with a growing problem inside the family. Responsibility was beginning to shift toward William, while Camilla's office still carried influence built through years beside the monarch. A royal household simply means the staff and working structure supporting a senior royal's official duties, and the overlap between those households had started creating tension. The king had tolerated many informal interventions from his wife because he valued her experience, yet even he could see the boundaries becoming harder to defend. Camilla pushed that boundary further at Windsor. During the private strategy meeting, she argued that a category of future household appointments connected to William should continue passing through her office for consultation, even as the prince assumed greater responsibility. She framed it as continuity, not control. But William understood the consequence immediately. If his future decisions still required another household's informal approval, then responsibility would be his in name, while influence remained somewhere else. William answered calmly, but the message was unmistakable. He told Charles that an heir could not inherit responsibility, while another office retained what amounted to informal veto power over his choices. A veto means the ability to block or delay a decision, even without holding formal control. Camilla rejected that interpretation. She insisted that continuity protected the monarchy from inexperienced decisions, and that long-serving advisors should not be pushed aside simply because authority was beginning to move toward the next generation. Charles heard something far more serious in those words. He did not hear advice. He heard a challenge to the authority he intended William to inherit. The king had spent years preparing the prince for greater responsibility, and allowing blurred influence to continue would weaken that transition before it had fully begun. Camilla saw caution. He saw a line being crossed. The meeting ended without shouting. William left first, carrying the weight of what had just been said. Camilla remained seated, still convinced her argument had been misunderstood. Charles closed the folder between them and told her quietly that she had crossed a boundary he had assumed neither of them needed to define. She stared back, wounded and angry, but the monarch did not soften the words. That night, Charles ordered a review of every informal privilege and internal access arrangement connected to Camilla's office. That review became the sealed file behind the final directive. And when she later discovered that William's objection had helped trigger it, she demanded a private confrontation. What began as a disagreement over influence was now something painfully personal. Because Charles and Camilla were finally about to confront the question neither had wanted to ask aloud: who mattered more when marriage and monarchy collided? There were no advisors in the room to soften the language, no secretary to redirect the argument, no ceremony to hide behind. Camilla entered knowing Charles had reviewed her royal access, but she still believed their history would restrain him. Instead, the king told her the restrictions would stand. Her expression hardened, his voice remained controlled, and within minutes, decades of shared loyalty were being measured against one brutal question: crown or marriage? Charles had insisted on meeting her alone because he refused to let courtiers witness what had become both a royal decision and a deeply personal crisis. A constitutional decision, in simple terms, is one made to protect how the monarchy functions, rather than to settle a private argument. He wanted that distinction understood. Camilla came prepared to negotiate anyway. She believed the directive could still be softened before every restriction became part of daily palace practice. Camilla challenged him almost immediately. She accused Charles of allowing William's concerns to carry more weight than the loyalty she had shown through years of public pressure, family hostility, and relentless scrutiny. The Queen Consort did not speak like someone defending a privilege. She spoke like someone defending her place in his life. Charles listened without interrupting, but when he finally answered, his words were sharper than she expected. Loyalty, he told her, did not create permanent entitlement to authority. Charles refused to retreat. He reminded her that his responsibility as sovereign meant he could not ignore blurred lines simply because the person involved was his wife. A sovereign is the reigning monarch who carries final responsibility for the crown's official direction, and he believed that responsibility had now become impossible to separate from what happened at Windsor. Camilla heard the explanation, but she did not accept the emotional cost. To her, duty had become the language he was using to justify distance. Camilla then asked the question that changed the temperature of the room. Had William wanted her removed entirely? Charles did not answer directly. The silence was devastating. She stared at him, waiting for a denial that never came. And in that pause, she felt every fear deepen. Then she revealed something of her own. Through a documented private family exchange, she had learned Harry was already contacting relatives about the decision. Charles reacted with controlled frustration. He warned her that Harry's involvement would not change the directive, no matter how loudly his son objected. Camilla rose abruptly, pushing her chair back. Before leaving, she told him that one day he might discover he had protected the institution by sacrificing everyone willing to stand beside him. The king did not follow her, but the Queen's anger was only one battle. Beyond that closed door, Harry was already moving toward a confrontation that would force Charles to defend not only what he had decided, but whether he still understood his own family. Harry could rage. Camilla could protest. Courtiers could worry about the consequences, but none of them could escape the reality beneath the drama. Charles was not merely a husband making a private choice. He was the sovereign, determining how authority would operate around the crown. And once the machinery of the royal household began adjusting to his order, Camilla discovered how quickly symbolic power could become real isolation. Charles watched the directive move from paper into practice almost immediately. Briefing lists were altered, ceremonial approvals were rerouted, and forms of access that had once been automatic now required direct authorization. A ceremonial approval is simply official permission for a royal duty, appearance, or action to proceed in the monarch's name. The changes looked technical on the page. In reality, they reshaped who could act. who could decide, and who now had to ask. William received confirmation that the restrictions were being implemented, but there was no satisfaction in his reaction. The prince knew Camilla believed his objections had helped bring this humiliation down on her, and that knowledge left him deeply uneasy. He had wanted clearer boundaries around the future of the monarchy, not a family war. Charles understood that difference. He made certain the heir gained no direct authority over the queen consort, centralizing control under himself instead. William paused outside his father's working room before entering. He chose his words carefully. "This cannot become revenge," Charles answered without hesitation that it never was. The king meant it, but even he could feel how much harsher the practical consequences looked now that staff were enforcing them. A restriction written in restrained language could still feel brutal when it changed a person's daily place inside the institution. Charles received an even more troubling warning later. According to a documented private account from a senior courtier, Harry had described the decision as a dangerous precedent, arguing that royal status could now be narrowed whenever personal trust with the monarch collapsed. The king rejected that charge immediately. He insisted this was about defined responsibility, not emotional punishment. Yet the accusation unsettled him enough that he ordered every restriction and every reason behind it carefully recorded. That order revealed how seriously he took his son's challenge. Charles did not want history to read the decision as an act of anger, while Harry was already preparing to argue that intention mattered less than consequence. William remained caught between them, supporting the boundary while fearing what the conflict was becoming. And Camilla was about to feel that consequence more sharply than anyone. The first visible blow arrived sooner than expected. She appeared for a royal obligation, believing the worst had already happened in private, only to discover that one familiar privilege had quietly disappeared. Yet, intentions matter less once consequences become visible, and Camilla was about to experience the new reality, not as another argument with her husband, but as something the entire royal machine had begun enforcing around her. The most painful punishments are sometimes the quietest. There was no dramatic announcement waiting for Camilla when she arrived for her next official obligation. Instead, there was a changed briefing arrangement, a missing place in the usual sequence, and one courteous sentence from an aide explaining that authorization now rested elsewhere. For the first time, the consequences of Charles's order were not theoretical. They were happening around her, and everyone in the room understood why. Camilla opened the revised briefing and noticed the missing section almost immediately. A royal briefing is the internal material given to senior members of the family before official duties, so they understand decisions, schedules, and sensitive matters connected to their role. She had seen that section many times before. Now it was gone. The household had implemented the restriction discreetly, without public humiliation, but the message was unmistakable. Access she had once assumed was automatic, now depended on someone else's approval. Camilla looked toward the aide and asked whether the change came directly from Charles. The answer was yes. She did not argue. She closed the folder, pressed her fingertips against its cover, and dismissed the room. When the aide quietly asked whether she needed anything else, the queen consort answered, "No, I understand." But understanding did not make the moment easier. Her husband's decision had moved beyond a private disagreement and entered the rhythm of everyday palace life. Charles had deliberately protected as much of her public schedule as possible. The king wanted her dignity preserved, even while he reduced the discretion attached to her position. That distinction mattered because removing engagements would have looked like rejection, while restricting internal authority sent a narrower message. Yet the separation felt almost cruel in practice. Camilla could still stand beside him publicly, while knowing that behind the scenes, parts of her old influence no longer existed. Harry learned what had happened through a documented private family exchange, and his anger returned immediately. The prince treated the incident as proof that the directive was not merely administrative. To him, Camilla was being diminished one quiet step at a time, while the palace avoided saying so openly. Charles rejected that interpretation, but his son had already made up his mind. This time, Harry demanded an in-person meeting. Charles agreed. Then he made one unexpected decision of his own. He asked William to stay away. The future king understood why. If he entered the room, Harry could easily turn the confrontation into another argument about succession, influence, and rivalry between brothers. The king wanted no shield between himself and his son. Harry did not understand, or refused to accept, the same reality Camilla had just been forced to face, and the confrontation ahead would strip away protocol until only a father and an angry son remained. Harry entered expecting to defend Camilla. He left confronting something far closer to himself. With no William, no courtiers, and no advisors in the room, he accused Charles of turning royal authority into a weapon against people who disappointed him. His father did not shout back. Instead, the king asked Harry whether every boundary now looked like punishment because of what had happened between them. The question landed harder than anger, and changed the entire conversation. Harry refused to soften his point. He argued that when trust broke down inside the family, status, access, and personal estrangement always seemed to become tangled together. Royal authority, in plain terms, meant the practical power attached to official duties, access, and decision-making within the monarchy. The prince believed those tools could become emotionally destructive when used against someone already isolated. Charles listened, but he rejected the comparison. Camilla's case, he said, was about defined responsibility, not affection. Harry pushed harder. He told his father that removing practical status while insisting personal love remained unchanged was exactly the contradiction that had wounded their family before. Charles finally reacted, not with anger, but with something closer to exhaustion. The king admitted that signing the order had hurt him. He had not wanted to diminish his wife, but refusing to act would have meant protecting his own comfort, while leaving unclear boundaries around the succession he was preparing William to inherit. Charles made that distinction painfully clear. The succession means the planned transfer of the crown and royal responsibility to the next monarch, and he believed William had to inherit authority without hidden overlap or competing influence around him. Harry understood the logic, even as he hated its cost. The prince had entered convinced that his father was preparing to keep stripping Camilla's position until nothing meaningful remained. Then Charles gave him the answer he had not expected. There would be no second, harsher move. The directive was final, but it was also limited. Camilla would remain part of family life, continue beside him publicly, and retain her dignity. The queen consort would not be pushed into some humiliating public exile, but the authority already removed would not be restored. Harry's anger did not disappear. It changed. He was no longer certain this was revenge, and that uncertainty unsettled him more than certainty had. At the end of the meeting, the prince reached the door, stopped, and asked whether Charles would make the same decision, knowing it could damage their relationship again. His father answered quietly, "Yes." That single word settled the private argument without healing it. But outside the family, the decision was already moving toward public view, and Britain was about to judge Charles through a far louder, harsher, and less forgiving lens. By morning, the private order had become a national argument. Broadcasters debated whether Charles had protected the monarchy or wounded his own household. Commentators dissected Harry's fury. Camilla's silence became part of the story. Yet one moment captured the mood better than any panel discussion. Outside Buckingham Palace, a crowd gathered beneath a newspaper front page carrying two faces. Charles looking rigid, Camilla unsmiling, and one enormous word beneath them: final. Charles understood immediately that the crisis had escaped the walls of the family. News coverage described the move as a rare redefinition of a senior royal's practical authority, meaning the everyday access, approval, and influence a working member of the monarchy can exercise behind official appearances. Palace communications stressed continuity instead of punishment. Camilla would remain beside the king publicly. What officials refused to discuss were the internal restrictions that had changed the balance between them. Harry hated that silence. Through a recorded private conversation, later described in a documented account, the prince complained that a painful family dispute had become public theater, while the palace controlled only the safest parts of the explanation. When asked whether he still believed Charles had gone too far, he refused to withdraw his criticism. Yet his anger now carried hesitation. The confrontation with his father had shown him that the order had limits, even if he still believed those limits should never have been imposed. Camilla reacted differently. She watched only minutes of a televised discussion before switching it off. The queen consort told a trusted companion that she would not allow strangers to explain what existed between her and Charles. Still, the public moment outside Buckingham Palace was impossible to ignore. People held up a newspaper front page showing husband and wife divided by a hard vertical line beneath the headline, "The King's Final Move." Phones rose. Conversations spread. The image turned a private fracture into something everyone could interpret. William refused to join that spectacle. The prince issued no triumphant statement and made no attempt to present the restrictions as a victory for the future reign. His silence mattered. Gradually, the story began shifting away from the idea of competing royal camps and towards something darker. A monarch had imposed boundaries on his own wife because he believed the institution could no longer function safely without them. Charles prepared for his next engagement while cameras gathered outside the gates. Before leaving, the king asked one question: "Is she coming?" When he was told that Camilla intended to attend, he gave a single nod. The answer carried more weight than any palace statement. The world had already delivered its judgment. But the only verdict that mattered now would come from Charles, Camilla, Harry, and William, after the anger had nowhere left to hide. In the end, Charles did not reverse the order. Camilla did not surrender her place beside him. Harry did not pretend the decision had stopped hurting him. And William did not celebrate a victory he had never wanted to look like one. The crisis ended not with reconciliation in the sentimental sense, but with something harder: acceptance. Royal authority had been redrawn, family wounds had been exposed, and every person involved was forced to decide what could survive after trust changed. Charles kept the restrictions exactly where he had placed them. Camilla retained her title, her marriage, her principal public role, and her place beside the king, but the independent authority she had once exercised was not restored. Royal authority, in practical terms, meant the access, discretion, and ability to act within official duties without seeking fresh approval. William gained no personal control over her. The future king simply inherited clearer boundaries, while his father kept full responsibility for the decision that had created them. Camilla met Charles privately one final time before their next joint appearance. She told him she could live with losing access more easily than she could live with knowing he had doubted her judgment. The queen consort did not ask him to pretend the crisis had never happened. She wanted something more difficult: recognition of what his decision had cost between them. Charles did not offer a false apology, and he did not reopen the order. Instead, the king told her that disagreement over duty could not erase the years they had built together. Harry faced a different choice. In a documented private conversation with Camilla afterward, the prince expected anger from her, perhaps even encouragement to keep challenging Charles. Instead, she told him his fury could not restore authority already removed. More importantly, she did not want another permanent family war fought in her name. Harry remained convinced his father had gone too far, but he finally understood that continuing the battle would only deepen damage she herself no longer wanted amplified. William responded with restraint. The prince treated the new boundaries as responsibility, not conquest. He made no attempt to claim victory over Camilla, and that choice prevented the succession from becoming a weapon in the family dispute. Charles noticed it. So did Harry. The crisis had exposed painful divisions, but it had also drawn a line none of them could now pretend was unclear. Camilla approached Charles before their next joint appearance with no aides between them. For several seconds neither spoke. Then the king extended his hand. She looked at it, hesitated, and took it. The gesture did not erase what had happened. It acknowledged something harder. Their marriage would continue, but under boundaries both now fully understood. And that became the final meaning of Charles's decision. Camilla remained beside the king. Harry's revolt ended without changing the order. William's future authority stood protected, without forcing anyone into public defeat. There would be no restoration of the old arrangement, and no hidden reversal. The decision stood, and so, in a more fragile but more clearly defined form, did the family. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.